Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We're pleased to welcome Jared Meyer, a fellow at the Manhattan Institute and the co-author of Disinherited, How Washington is Betraying America's Young. Jared, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me again, Bill.
Jared, Uber's ride-sharing service represents one of the most dramatic improvements in urban transportation since the subway was invented. As a city dweller, I'll confess my bias. Thanks to Uber and Zipcar, I don't even own a car anymore. The backlash from taxi cartels is expected, but there's been a surprising animosity from progressive politicians, both in the U.S. and abroad. From a political economy perspective, what is it that triggered so many leftist politicians to side with taxi medallion millionaires against consumers?
Well, it's really surprised me how we've seen Uber become a political issue, because this doesn't really make sense, especially if you look on the state and local level. Opposition or support of Uber isn't really split among ideological lines. But at the national level, we have Republican presidential candidates such as Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio emphatically embracing Uber, whereas you have Hillary Clinton railing against the so-called gig economy and saying that workers are getting a bad deal out of this. Well, I disagree with her there, and also she's ignoring the tremendous benefits that consumers have seen from innovation.
Is this going to backfire on those folks?
I think it will, especially with the millennial vote. Both parties are trying to court young voters who still remain politically unaligned. But if you're standing up and getting between them and their Uber, it's going to be hard for a millennial to want to support you. I've even heard the term thrown around Ubertarians to describe millennials, where they're libertarian when it comes to Uber. So.
It does cut across regular ideology, because how could you live in a city without Uber if you're a young person?
I know. Well, hey, I'd have to buy a car just like you. I don't need one right now. It's much cheaper to be able to use these convenient transportation options rather than dealing with owning your own car.
Ground zero of the fight here in the U.S. seems to be New York, and New York Mayor Bill de Blasio has made claims that Uber is somehow going to reduce transportation options for low-income New Yorkers. You recently authored a report based on examining detailed ridership data. What were the issues and what did you learn?
Well, I worked with Uber and was able to access all of their ride data in the New York City area for the entire 2014. And what I found by looking at the pattern of rides, starting and ending zip code, no personal information was shared. But what I found was that as Uber grew, and it saw impressive growth in 2014 in New York City, rides from January till December, the monthly totals increased 450%.
Wow.
So when I looked at where this growth went to, it was going to low-income neighborhoods that didn't have transportation options before. So you would think a proudly progressive mayor such as Bill de Blasio, who ran on bringing the whole city together and not just being the mayor of Manhattan, would embrace this service.
Didn't the taxi industry try some sort of borough cab service to get a few more cabs out to the boroughs rather than just in central Manhattan?
The taxi industry didn't really try it. They fought tooth and nail to try to keep the borough or green taxi program out. But that has seen growth, and it's done pretty well, and it's helped to expand transportation options. But, for example, I lived out in Jamaica, Queens for 4 years in a residential neighborhood. There was no way that a green cab was just going to be cruising down my streets. I would have had to go to a local, one of the main drags, Hillside Drive, by me to try to pick up a green cab. Now people can call one right from their house, and late at night, maybe when someone doesn't want to go out on a street that's a little bit dangerous, this is something that really helps consumers and expands the transportation options. If it wasn't such a great option, we wouldn't have seen the massive growth going on.
I'm always surprised in New York when I do use a cab that the driver turns me down based on where I want to go. I thought they weren't supposed to be allowed to do that.
Well, there's a lot of things they're not supposed to do, such as tell you that their credit card machine's broken when it's actually working in an effort to get a cash fare. It's because these New York City cabs, especially the yellow cabs, they've been insulated from competition for so long by this medallion system where the government only lets a certain number of cars be licensed to be on the road, that their customer service has noticeably started to suffer. In fact, there's fewer yellow cabs on the streets of New York City right now than there were in the 1930s.
That's unbelievable.
So even though New York's population has grown since then, they have fewer cabs.
Well, as a frequent visitor to New York, I've definitely noticed that cabs have gotten cleaner since Uber came to town. As taxi medallion prices crash from $1 million to heading to zero, the cost of delivering cab services should plummet. With drivers no longer carrying the medallion financing burden, could the taxi industry slash prices to better compete with Uber?
They could, but they would have to go through the Taxi and Limousine Commission because they're not free to just change rates on their own. They have to adhere to predetermined set prices. But also, one of the problems is the taxi drivers themselves don't really own the medallion.
Right.
It's more of big taxi moguls or even banks that have invested in these. So what they do then are the drivers lease out the cars for the day, and that's how the medallion owners make their money. So I would expect that we're going to see lower lease rates to try to attract drivers back to taxis because they're fleeing to Uber as well because they get to be their own boss. They get to work as much or as little as they want. They don't have to show up at a garage and wait to be dispatched. It's a good deal for drivers as well.
Well, my understanding under the old rules, medallions went for $1 million. If you leased a cab for a typical 12-hour shift, more than half of that shift was spent paying off the medallion.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And rather than if some of these drivers, maybe they own their own car on the side as well, because most taxi drivers are from Queens in New York City. So then they have their own car sitting at home getting no use when they could be taking that out and driving for Uber or Lyft instead.
Among the complaints, de Blasio has been blaming Manhattan traffic congestion on Uber. Is there any evidence to back this up?
Well, this is just laughable. It makes no sense to blame Uber alone on increased traffic in Manhattan. Subway ridership's at, I think, a 65-year high. People are moving back to the city. The city is really just growing in general. And also there's been countless new bike lanes, pedestrian walkways put in. So just blaming it on Uber, which is less than 1% of cars coming into the city every day, really makes no sense. And even though, let's say Uber was slowing down traffic, de Blasio should embrace this because he has this Vision Zero initiative where he wants zero traffic fatalities, and slower traffic is one of the ways to do this. So it just shows you that he picks and chooses his targets because first he tried to argue against consumer safety. Well, that was clearly proven wrong. Then he tried to argue it was a bad deal for drivers. That was proven wrong. Now he's moved on to traffic congestion and just focusing on downtown and midtown Manhattan, which was the part of the city, as I said, he wasn't going to just look out for their interest. He was going to try to watch out for all New Yorkers.
Well, there's been a lot of turmoil on the city council. You know, if you follow the news, you see initiatives come up and go in terms of putting limits. What kind of limits is de Blasio trying to impose on Uber to mollify the taxi cartel?
Well, what he was trying to do was put in a 1% cap on growth for transportation network companies such as Uber. And Uber would have been really the only one that was affected, possibly Lyft, but Uber has a 90% market share in New York. So actually, I was happy that Uber decided to fight this proposed cap because it really would have solidified their market share as the leader in ride sharing if they would have cut off all other companies once they got big from growing even more. But Uber went to social media. They had celebrities supporting them. They took their case to the public, and the public backlash was so strong against de Blasio's plan that he had to scrap it. So now they're doing a 4-month traffic congestion study, but all ride-sharing firms are free to expand as much as they want during that time.
Well, that's a pretty unusual reaction for Uber because usually when you challenge a cartel and the politicians fight back, the first thing they do is invite you into the smoke-filled room to cut a deal so you can keep your future competitors out. Why do you figure Uber didn't take that approach?
Well, I think because they realized that, first of all, if they tried to negotiate with these politicians, most of whom are in the pockets of the taxi industry, for example, Mayor de Blasio got over $500,000 for his campaign from the taxi industry. So he's clearly going to be looking out for their interests. And we've seen this time and time again. Maybe a new industry starts up and it escapes regulator sights for a while, but once it starts getting big and putting more competition into the market, regulators move to shut it down. So I think Uber just saw that this was probably going to happen with them and decided instead to move into a market where we really don't know if it's legal or illegal because these laws were written before the internet.
Sure.
And in the case of New York in the 1930s. So it makes no sense to say that, oh, Uber's illegal. Well, when these laws were written, no one could have thought about that, all the innovation that's happened. So Uber moves in, they get the public on its side, and then they make sure that in a lot of cases they've been successful in the U.S. of being able to still operate and establish a legal framework where they can move forward.
It's almost a civil disobedience strategy.
In a way, I mean, maybe they're following Charles Murray's new prescriptions in from his new book of saying, hey, these regulations aren't protecting consumers. They're about protecting established industries, and it harms everyone. So there's no reason, especially when they don't directly apply to us, that we need to somehow follow these antiquated regulations. Because there is one thing that's not changing. people bring up what I think the price of a medallion will fall to now, and I don't think it will go to zero because the yellow cabs still have a monopoly on street hails. You know, the familiar, dreaded act of where you're standing on the side of the road with your hand up, waving like an idiot, hoping that an empty
Uber
yellow
doesn't do
cab
that.
drives by. So Uber's not trying to move into that territory. But just to show you the lengths that the taxi companies will go to, I get calls constantly from credit unions who have invested in these medallions or gave out loans so that people could buy them. And they call me and say, no, someone taking out their phone and pressing buttons, then waiting 5 minutes for an Uber to show up, that's the same as standing on the side of the road waving your hand. I mean, this is not even close to the same thing. There's no way that taking out your phone is the same as a street hail where you're standing on the side of the road.
So, Jared, one of the more interesting and controversial aspects of Uber's business model is something called surge pricing. It remains controversial among politicians, and even consumers grumble about it. Explain how surge pricing works and what the consequences would be of banning it.
Surge pricing is a way that Uber can make sure that you can always get a ride when you want one. So in times of high demand, think, for example, on New Year's Eve after bar close or on a Friday afternoon or evening rush hour, a ride might cost 1.5 times more than it usually does or 3 times more. So what happens is when you take out your app, a consumer's told, okay, Uber's surging right now, and if you accept the higher prices, you have to actually press in the numbers of how much more it's going to cost, then you can go about your ride. But what this does is it not only decreases the demand for Ubers because the price is higher, but it also increases the supply of drivers. Because what driver would want to be out on the road at 2 a.m. when they could be in their bed, unless if they have an opportunity to make more money? So it works on both sides to really make sure that people can get a ride when they need one.
Supply and demand continues to confuse most people. I know if I go out on this corner and I push Uber and it's a 2X, all that says to me is, hey, if a cab comes by, grab it, because that's about the break-even price.
Or even it could say, hey, you know what, I'm just going to take an extra half hour to get home and take the subway instead of trying to call a car.
Yep. Now, New York State has a law that makes it illegal to sell products at an unconscionably excessive price during an abnormal disruption of the market. I'm wondering what that means and how that could be applied to Uber surge pricing.
Well, great question with what that means. There's nothing like laws that have very vague terms that it opens it up for political enforcement. And what we've seen is Uber actually came to a deal with New York Attorney General Eric Schneiderman to cap their surge pricing during times of natural disasters. And this is more of a PR move because it doesn't look good, obviously, to be charging more money when people are in need. But the fact remains, how are they going to get more drivers on the road, especially during things like a blizzard? What driver wants to be out there if they're just going to make their normal fare that they would on a sunny day? But what Uber's facing now in New York is a cap at 100% of surge pricing at all times. This has been introduced in the city council, and I expect this to be de Blasio's next move because public opposition to surge pricing remains strong.
Right.
But if you think about it, the whole point of surge pricing is you're supposed to not want to take Uber when it's on surge if you don't really need a ride. But consumers don't realize how much this is integral to the ride-sharing business model and that they'll be left how they were before, standing on the side of the street in the rain, hoping that they can hail a yellow cab if they try to lower Uber's surge pricing ability.
That does require consumers and voters to think 2 moves ahead, though, and that doesn't happen very often.
Well, let's hope on this one that they can mobilize the public again in opposition to this surge pricing cap.
Let's look internationally for a moment. Nowhere has the pushback against Uber been stronger than in France. There's actually been violence in the streets perpetrated by French taxi drivers, and Uber executives have even been arrested and hauled off to jail. What's going on over there?
Well, the arrests, surprisingly, have been tied to Uber drivers or their driver partners rather than the people carrying out the violence. So these taxi drivers feel threatened, of course, that Uber's cutting into their profits and making them improve their customer service. So instead of competing in the marketplace, they've decided to take their fight to the government and have them go after Uber. One of the craziest things the taxi drivers do is called Operation Escargot, which is Operation Snail for those of you like me who aren't very good at French. But what they do is drive around slowly and just create traffic jams all over the city and around the airport. So this is, I don't know how they expect to get consumers on their side when they're causing traffic jams and ruining the streets and resorting to violence. But yeah, it's surprising seeing what's going on in Europe where consumers seem to be less friendly to new innovation.
Well, it's not just that. French consumers tend to have a lot of solidarity with strikers. It seems to be in the culture.
Yeah, if they're fine paying higher prices for inferior service, they can go for it. But I don't know why they want to cut off everything else for other people in France who maybe can't afford to take a taxi or spend time waiting around outside waiting for one to drive by.
Well, in France, it's against the law to work more than 35 hours a week, which applies to any regularly employed taxi drivers. UberX drivers are independent contractors, so the law doesn't apply to them. Is it really fair to allow people to work harder just to make more money? Isn't this a blow against the French vision of equality?
Well, there's a lot of problems with their idea of a 35-hour week, and they seem to just love putting limits in the labor market that make it harder for dynamic new technologies to take off. For example, the taxi drivers in France, what they wanted to do was impose a 30-minute wait on calling an Uber. So you take out your app, you press the button, and it says, oh, just so you know, minimum 30-minute wait. They ended up going forward with a 15, which was somewhat of a compromise, and then that even got scrapped. But could you imagine putting in this 30-minute wait? That's just a way to explain that you cannot compete, and you now need to limit your competitors to even have a chance.
As free market as London is, I think London has been also looking at the same thing to protect their famous black car taxi drivers.
Well, I know Boris Johnson, the mayor of London, he's even come out and said he's not really a big fan of Uber, yet the service is allowed to operate there as of now. So I think compared to the rest of Europe, London looks strong. But to show you how different the regulatory environments in Europe and the U.S. are, I mean, as bad as they are here, there's been this new app launched called Arrow, which has been hailed as the savior of the taxi industry. And all it is Uber for taxis, except it doesn't have surge pricing and it doesn't have the feedback system afterwards where you can rate drivers. Well, its predecessor, Halo, which was exactly the same thing, completely left the U.S. and is now only focusing on competing in Europe and Asia, where they view regulators as more friendly towards the taxis than they are in the U.S.
Many politicians have attempted to stop Uber using the safety issue, raising fears that unlicensed UberX drivers represent some kind of crime threat against the public compared to taxi drivers. What does the data show?
Well, if we look at New York, for example, this argument doesn't make sense on its face because Uber drivers still have to be licensed by the Transportation and Limousine Commission, just as taxi drivers do. So they have to go through the same background checks, the same vehicle safety requirements. So in New York, at least, this one just makes no sense. But even in other markets, Uber and Lyft, they're all going to go to extreme lengths to make sure that they have qualified drivers working behind the wheel. Because what we see is, as soon as you get out of a car, you have the opportunity to rate your driver and say if you enjoyed the ride. Well, if anything bad happened, they're going to start kicking off their drivers because they don't want people working for them who are going to disappoint their customers, much less injure them. And we've seen this play out, how the taxi industry is grabbed onto any time that anything has happened that's bad in an Uber. For example, back in 2013 on New Year's Eve, a young girl was tragically killed in San Francisco. Well, the taxi industry continues to talk about this just because they don't have new examples. But if we look at it right now, ride sharing is a much safer business model than traditional taxis. If you wanted to commit a crime, I couldn't think of a better place than inside of a cab. For one, it's completely anonymous.
Right.
And secondly, there's tons of cash being carried. And this is why taxi drivers have twice the homicide rate of police officers and 40 times the U.S. average. So it's safer for drivers as well.
Now that you mention it, let's flip around and talk a little about the drivers. How much do UberX drivers make compared to taxi drivers, both here and abroad?
Well, it'll depend on which market and how often they work, but according to estimates that I've looked at, it seems that they make as much or more than taxi drivers in all the markets I've examined. But one of the problems is we don't know how far they are driving, and that brings into account gasoline costs, which would have to be looked at. But I think the major point is even if they weren't making more money, many people would still decide to drive for Uber because of the increased flexibility. They're their own boss. They can work as much or as little as they like. In New York, only 10% of Uber driver partners work more than 50 hours a week, whereas all taxi drivers are working more than that. So this gives an opportunity for someone to maybe keep paying their bills while they're in between jobs or earn a little extra money to afford sky-high New York rent as a second job. These are all options that we want to leave open to people so that they can pursue that.
Well, you know, every time I get in an Uber, I ask the driver how long you've been driving for Uber and how do you like it. And the first thing they always mention is the flexibility. A lot of them are former cab drivers. They've been driving for years. They don't want to put the hours in. A lot of them are going to school. A lot of them have 2 jobs, so they work Uber part-time. In fact, they come out when there's surge pricing, which speaks to that issue. The only time I've ever gotten a complaint from an Uber driver is on this new feature called Uber Pool that they're experimenting with in Boston, where you can actually share an Uber ride with a stranger, and the IT system matches you up. Have you gotten any feedback on that from drivers?
I haven't heard much because I'm in Washington, D.C., and they're just starting to push this out here. It's been successful in California, but what they need is a lot of people getting in on this Uber Pool because it matches people going together in the same way with close pickup points. But I could imagine if the pickup points were pretty far from each other or the drop-off points, that could end up being a worse deal for drivers because obviously it lowers prices for consumers. I know in New York, for example, they have 2 options. UberX, the traditional model, which is save time, and then they have Uber Pool, which is save money. So it gives people more choices, but if a lot of people aren't on Uber Pool, I could see it that drivers have to do a lot of the driving around crowded blocks to try to find a pickup or drop-off, which they don't make much money on that point because they make more money for distance rather than time.
Well, you would think the whole supply and demand flexibility equation would work it out at some point. The drivers would push back. They'd stop picking up Uber Pool people, or Uber itself would have to adjust its pricing scheme.
Yeah, I think we're in an awkward phase right now where it's trying to grow and people maybe aren't comfortable with it right now, sharing a ride with a stranger, whereas a few years ago, maybe some people weren't comfortable in getting in a car that wasn't a licensed cab. But we've seen now is people have seen the benefits and the lower cost. They've decided to go with this. So Uber Pool, I'm optimistic in the future it's going to end up working out as well.
Well, it's almost all I use now. Out of the 10 rides I've taken on Uber Pool since I started using it, I've only had to share the cab twice. Once I had a fantastic conversation about real estate investment, and the second time I agreed to be a mentor to an entrepreneur who figured out who I was and asked for my card. So, I've had no downside on that. It's going to be interesting to see how it grows.
Yeah, well, that'll be hard for future rides to keep up with that.
Jared, we always appreciate having you on the show. We'll have to have you back again. Thanks for coming on.
Hey, thanks again.
That was Jared Meyer from the Manhattan Institute here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program now broadcast in 11 cities and online. To make sure you don't miss any of our shows, sign up for updates on realclearradio.org. And if you'd like to help us bring more guests like this on the air, please hit the donate button or contact us to become a corporate supporter. That wraps up our show for this week. Please join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.